Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the event today, our Source Baltimore Week keynote presentation. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Shane Bryan. I'm the Assistant Director at Source, which is the Center for Community Engagement and Service Learning that works with Johns Hopkins University Schools of Public Health, Medicine, and Nursing. So thank you all for coming today. Just so I can get a sense, we can get a sense of who else in the room. How many of you are from the School of Medicine, or do we have any medicine? A couple of folks. One. Fantastic. Thank you for coming. How about School of Nursing? Any School of Nursing? Great. Public Health? Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you all for coming today and participating in this conversation. This is just one of many events that we're hosting during Baltimore Week. We do have some more events coming up that I'd like to share with you. Later today at 4 p.m., the NED Talks group in the School of Nursing is hosting an event called Historical Trauma, Community Health, and How We Can Make Baltimore Whole Again. They'll be hosting Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's an assistant professor at Morgan State University in their Community Health and Policy program. That's going to be at 4 p.m. in the School of Nursing, room 9. Tomorrow, we're hosting a very exciting event, also in the School of Nursing courtyard from 4 to 5:30. We'll actually be working with Do More Baltimore, which is a group, a nonprofit here in Baltimore that works with youth to empower them through art and spoken word via social justice. So they're bringing 6 of their performers to campus to have them share with us their Baltimore through spoken word. So I invite you all to come and join us. It's going to be a very fun and interactive event tomorrow in the School of Nursing's courtyard from 4 to 5:30 with Do More Baltimore. On Friday, we'll be hosting an East Baltimore bus tour. I know many of you have already participated on bus tours, but if you haven't had a chance yet to come on our East Baltimore bus tour, I invite you to send an email to source@jhu.edu with your name, school affiliation, and phone number so we can get you registered for that. We'll be leaving the School of Public Health at 12, and we'll be back no later than 1:30 tomorrow, or Friday, excuse me, that's on Friday. We also have a photo contest that's going on for Baltimore Week. If you want to send in your photos of Baltimore, what's important about Baltimore, what you love about Baltimore, how do you identify Baltimore via imagery, you can send those photos to source@jhu.edu. All photos that we receive by 4 p.m. will be judged for that day. If we receive anything after 4, we'll just put it into the next day's pool of judging. The winner is being featured on the daily winners are being featured on Streets of Baltimore Facebook page. Our grand prize winner will be featured in the print edition of the City Paper, and all photos will be featured in the City Paper's online journal. And then finally, for Baltimore Week, we also have a food drive that's going on right now. All canned food and non-perishable items can be donated to the food drive. That actually will go through next week and end on Friday, October 16th. So a few more opportunities to get involved and become engaged, and I invite you to do so. So today, at this event, we've invited Mr. Stephen Ragsdale. He's a native Baltimorian and historian, and it's with great honor that we have him join us as the Source Baltimore Week keynote presentation. Stephen is currently the program administrator for health equity programs at LifeBridge Health, where he directs operations of equity initiatives including hospital and community efforts focused on health disparities reduction, both within LifeBridge facilities and the surrounding community. Formerly, he was an innovations coach at Johns Hopkins Armstrong Institute, focusing on the development of Johns Hopkins medicine health equity infrastructure. He's worked with various government entities and other divisions of Hopkins and is a member of multiple professional and community-based organizations and groups. He has great experience speaking to the history of social determinants in Baltimore. So today, I'm very honored to invite Mr. Ragsdale up to the stage to share with us all and discuss more systematic issues that led to the Baltimore Uprising this past spring. So thank you very much, Stephen.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. I would like to first thank the Source for inviting me back. I've been great friends with the Source since its inception. And so I really, really, really believe in the work that they do. And I also believe that folks who do this kind of work should have a fundamental understanding of what they're getting into. I grew up in East Baltimore, and we frequently had researchers come into our neighborhood, and folks from Hopkins. Um, and and my dad actually worked at Hopkins, and so, but I never really understood the relationship between Hopkins and Baltimore, in particular the African American community in Baltimore. And so I was asked to come in today to talk about, like more or less the subsystems that created the um, the Freddie Gray situation, right? And it's not just Freddie Gray; it's thousands of young black men around Baltimore City. And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend some time. We're going to talk about some social determinants, right? Of course, um, what's the stats here look like. 600,000 people roughly, right? 20% of them living below the poverty line, and like roughly 64% of them live below. 64% of them are African American. Now, the way that I talk about this is kind of like unusual. I mean, because what I do is I look at systems. In my world, before I got into kind of public health, I pulled together and pulled apart and pulled together these systems. And I'm also a historian. And so what I started to do is kind of look at the dynamic structures of how things work, function, together, and how they work as individual entities. And one of the things that you'll fully understand in this work, and I'm not going to get into the systems theory and the systems design, is that a system is the sum of its parts, right? And so the systems that we've created throughout the history of Baltimore, I'm going to more or less tell you some stories about them, right? And you can kind of get to understand these, what they've looked like over the years, in particular over the last 150 years. So we're going to talk about religion, policing, schools, all the things that are social determining factors in Baltimore. Now, Baltimore is actually divided up this way, northern into these like areas. It's actually 225 named neighborhoods, roughly, divided up into these little subsections. Anybody know what those subsections are? I mean, call it out if you know. Police districts. Yeah, so Baltimore is divided up into police districts. Um, Another distinguishing factor about Baltimore is because it was founded by Catholics, they signed an act of religious tolerance back in the 1600s, and that was more or less to make the Protestants comfortable with coming to Maryland and doing commerce, right? And so, like, there's religious tolerance for Christianity, but not for Jewish people. Jewish folks would not be able to kind of run for government until the mid 1800s, when what was titled a Jew bill passed. But you can see here's some of the founding structures. You have the first African American diocese in America in Baltimore City, St. Francis, building down here in the bottom right-hand corner, right? It's up on Caroline Street. And the First Baptist Church, which is right also on Caroline Street, right adjacent to the outpatient center. Another distinguishing factor about Baltimore is its steady growth, right? Why would you have this kind of growth, right? And then it kind of tails off. You start to see in the 1960s, right? But like between 1840, and like literally 1960, there's like steady penetrating growth, right? But African Americans are not actually part of the picture significantly, right? And so you see a small percentage, like roughly up until like 1940, Baltimore's mostly white, and then you start to see an inching up, if you will, of an African American population, right? And so now they make up 63% of the city. We got most of that growth between 1905 and 1960. And you guys heard of the Great Migration, right? Isabel Wilkinson wrote a great book called The Warmth of Other Suns. I encourage you to read it. But like a lot of these cities got lots and lots of African Americans, and literally the reason that this is important is because what's happening here is you are moving labor from one side of the country to the other side. Essentially, what you have is 90% at the beginning of the Civil War. 90% of African Americans lived below the Mason-Dixon line, and not much of that changed after the Civil War until you have this great migration of folks northward. Now, a little bit about Baltimore. Things that that you can literally find in the history books is, if you've ever seen that movie Gangs of New York, that's kind of what I kind of picture. It's loaded with political bosses. It's lots of factions in Baltimore. There's lots of ethnic neighborhoods in Baltimore. What I mean by ethnic neighborhoods, like European ethnicity, right? And that starts to grow and penetrate from 1880 until about the 1950s. These neighborhoods are very crowded. There's frequently housing shortages. But Baltimore is a place where wealth is created, if you will. It's kind of even in its agrarian day, it's kind of a very industrial town. People are here to make money, right? And so there's not a lot of infrastructure. And there's lots and lots of competition for space. And then what the agrarian economies do is they lay seed, if you will, for the Industrial Revolution. Now, anybody know who these folks are? Alex Brown, John Garrett. These are the what I like to call the job creators, right? These are the guys who come to Baltimore. They're more or less, none of them are from Baltimore. None of them are local, right? So they're coming from primarily from the north. Alex Brown would start the first brokerage house. He came here in 1800 from Ireland. The Walters were into railroads, right? Garrett starts the B&O Railroad. Glenn L. Martin starts what is now Martin Marietta. But these guys are coming to invest. There's a deep water harbor here. There's lots and lots and lots of favorable things about Baltimore. It sits in the middle of the country. It's the shortest distance from they call it the gateway to the Midwest. It's the shortest distance of any East Coast city to St. Louis. And so, as we're moving, expanding westward, as America is expanding westward, Baltimore is actually a great tool, right? That wealth is not concentrated in the white community, right? There's a need for low-cost labor, and blacks actually make up most of that from the 1600s deep into the 1800s. 60% of Baltimore's population is a free population, and so they are free to earn. Which is, I just told you that 90% of the African Americans live below the Mason-Dixon line. So that makes Baltimore extraordinarily unique in the way that they can make money, And here are the couple of folks who were principal in that. You had the Murphys, who started the African American newspaper, which is really, really essential to understand because blacks have no way of communicating, throughout the country. And they put together 7 church bulletins. Right, church is really important here. We'll get into that, and start literally a national movement of newspapers. Right, Isaac Myers owned a railroad and shipping company. If you go down to Fells Point, I forget the waterfront inn, on the second floor of the waterfront inn, you can learn all about Isaac Myers. Right, he was an industrialist who owned a railroad and shipping company and brought many along with him. Now, the thing about that's really, there's a couple of other folks that I want to kind of point out. Could not visit Johns Hopkins without talking about Johns Hopkins, right? And what is found, what I like to talk about his will in the state. One of the things that he did was he was a Quaker. Do you guys know that? And so because of his social tendencies, in his will, he provides funds to manage the poor of all races, right? And Johns Hopkins Hospital is one of those elements. there is also what do you call it? Oh, they don't have them around anymore. An orphanage, an orphanage for African American people. And there's not really a whole lot of there's really not a whole lot of evidence that what happened to it. But essentially, what this guy does is he lays the foundation. He understands how unbalanced this. There are no public systems for people doing large portions of work, and it's creating really a public health issue. And so what he does is he's established this endowment, and it's carried out by Francis King. Anybody know who Francis King is? He's actually, if you've ever been to the law school at University of Maryland, it's named after Francis King. Right? But he kind of carries out Johns Hopkins' will, and it's really important to understand that because what happens literally close to the death of Johns Hopkins is his will is really enforced, right? And the notions of his will are really enforced. But as time passes, Johns Hopkins and its elements begin to change, right? Another thing that's really important to understand about Baltimore, and I'm not going to spend any time on this, but travel around downtown Baltimore and you're going to see lots of buildings like this. They're all banks. Baltimore had more banks per capita than any other city in America, right? The thing that distinguishes them is the fact that you have a black earning class in this town, right, who could not engage in these banks. And so their methods of funding, their capital investments tend to be black market economies. One of the principal ones was the numbers game. Anybody understand? You know what the numbers game? It's the lottery. It's the modern day lottery. So Baltimore moves into this industrial age with lots of planes, building lots of planes, lots of ships. There's a shipping industry. It's literally the biggest port out of America. They are shipping steel out. You have Bethlehem Steel, which employs literally, I think about 10, 12,000 people around the clock, in round-the-clock shifts. After the war, women are brought into the marketplace. It's a place where, literally, up until the 60s, this place is dripping with cash. I mean, the place is loaded with cash. And so what happens to the underclass? The underclass, the subclasses of the economic classes are also making money. They just don't have the ability to capitalize. One of the things that you have to talk about when you talk about Baltimore is the fact that it's an industry town, because with an industry town, you get a lot of unintended consequences, if you will. One of the things that happen in Baltimore is the zealousness to produce. They produce like in their neighborhoods, and so they don't live far from, where these little factories, sub-factories are occurring. So Dundalk, this is Sparrows Point, and like right beside Sparrows Point is Dundalk, where, if you go out there today and people tell you stories about it, it's like, people who worked at Sparrows Point drove two cars. One that you could take to work and one that you couldn't, because the one that you took to work, you'd park it on the parking lot, and when you came out, the whole first level of your paint job was gone. It literally the dust from the air would melt away your paint job. And so people are in this factory inhaling. You've seen those mesothelioma commercials, all the law firm. That's what this is. This production has an after effect. Here's a statement. Everyone was aware of the potential illness. Here's a guy who's talking about going to work every day and having something float in the top of his coffee. But if you, this is from a book called Roots of Steel, who's written by a sociologist who actually grew up in Dundalk. And basically, what she wanted to kind of get to was how these people lived during this production. And I thought that this sentiment was perfect. It was a good paying job that you knew would propel your family forward, right? The interesting thing about Bethlehem Steel is Bethlehem Steel, during that peak where you see there's this rise in African American population, Bethlehem Steel was going to the South and recruiting those folks, because black people here were somewhat educated, knew of the risk of working in those environments, and the folks who were coming from the South were coming from sharecropping communities, right? And so these folks were being given the opportunity to make more money than they'd ever seen before. doing high-risk jobs, highly risky jobs. And so it's not like today where you go up and you put your application in, and the most qualified gets the job. These jobs are usually divided up by ethnicity, white and black. And rank, kind of a rank and file. So you could be an Italian, but if you were an Italian who did not speak English, then you would kind of rank a little lower in the job class. Very, very, very rich shipping industry here, right? This is a picture taken in the 1950s around the seaport. Does it look like a food desert? Right. I mean, so you have lots and lots and lots of food coming through Baltimore, and I like to tell people, like, a lot of it kind of fell off the truck, right? And so what that means is, Baltimore's never had lots of brick and mortar grocery stores, because we literally had folks on the back of trucks and wagons for the better part of, well, over a century, bringing those things from the docks into your neighborhood. And so we had a fruit day, a vegetable day, major Catholic city. Friday was a fish day. Guy brought fresh fish from the harbor. And so, the food economies in Baltimore were extraordinarily different. Some of the trade. Baltimore had a rich beer industry. The Hummanen building is actually a building that was a brewery that processed about 10,000 barrels of grain a day. So it was very, Brewers Hill. Some of you guys probably live on Brewers Hill right now, don't you? Well, they were not always apartments. One of the things that Baltimore does in order to kind of manage a lot of the this influx of business and this influx of people is they have to do some social modeling, right? In order to, this kind of production has to be managed, if you will. And there's a popular, and it's a pseudoscience, but it's a science, back in the late 1800s and deep into the 1900s. And it's literally a science that looks at you based on your physical characteristics and assumes certain things about you, based on those physical characteristics, mostly racial and mostly ethnic. And so there becomes a scale, of economic predictability. What your value will be to society, right? And this is one that was obviously developed by an Englishman, a German, a Scot, an Irish, or a Scandinavian, right? Because the other thing is, if you look at these, if you go through the history books and you look at it, you can almost tell like who created it, right? Now, the reason that this is a really important notion is this is not, like I said, this is serious science, in those days. And here's some of the eugenicists. The person who actually comes up with the concept is the first cousin of Charles Darwin, right? But here's some of the folks who who are disciples, if you will, of eugenics modeling. Margaret Sanger, right? Winston Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt, William Welch. William Welch, a father of research medicine, is a eugenicist. I encourage you to go across the street and read some of these writings. And it stays kind of like this, a very popular notion until about the 1940s. Right? And then it kind of dissipates. But by then, social policy, some of these policies are really taking root. And so this is really important because Baltimore has this migration in the 1880s that is literally beyond reproach. Baltimore becomes the second largest importer of humans behind Ellis Island. Right, it's right over on Locust Point. There's an immigration station set up. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of the ticket it's the Brems lane that would take cargo over. Decided one day, you know what? We're coming back empty-handed. Let's throw some tickets in people's hands and collect some dough. Right, and so a new business is born, and it's right on the heels of a lot of conflict that's going on in Europe at that point in time. I'm not going to go into that too much. But here, around 1882, right, record numbers start to arrive in Locust Point. And there was train stations that would kind of port them off to the north or to the Midwest. But there's a fair portion that stayed in Baltimore. And then they began to kind of create a home from East Harbor all the way out to kind of 95. And so across that little waterway, if you will, if you had these micro-ethnic communities, right, the Italians, the Jewish population a little far north, and you have a slither of African Americans on Central Avenue. You got the Lithuanians right over here on Patterson Park. You got Polish folks across Canton, who actually, the name comes from the fact that they established a new way of canning fruits and vegetables. So they were going across the street, taking some of their fruit and vegetables off the truck, and they came up with a new way of canning. They started opening up canning factories, and so everybody's kind of slicing out their own slice of the American pie, if you will, economically and from a land standpoint. Another instrument that's incredibly important is the Baltimore City Penitentiary. It starts out as a debtor's prison, and it's never been a good place. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but it's a way. It becomes a way of managing economics. So I want to talk specifically about the African American community, because the African American community in Baltimore is unique in a lot of different ways. Like I said, first off, the first African Americans to arrive in Baltimore arrived on the first boats here, the Ark and the Dove. One of the occupants of that boat was an indentured servant who would later go on to be the first legislator in Annapolis, the first black legislator in Annapolis, Matthew Mathias. And so they'd always had like a presence in the city and a need. Somebody had to do the channel, somebody had to do the grunt work, if you will. And by being kind of like a split city with respect to slavery, some of these folks got paid. So they were able to kind of create some economies on their own. Now, another person who really, really key to Baltimore is Frederick Douglass, because even though Frederick Douglass escapes and moves north and is a big part of the anti-slavery movement, after slavery ends, he comes back and he's like, these are the next steps that need to happen. There's a parade in Baltimore that starts in West Baltimore, ends up in East Baltimore, and it's the largest gathering of Americans in American history until 1950. That's how big this parade is. And they are celebrating the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Now, why are those amendments important? That's giving these people citizenship. This is a society or people who've been here for literally 150, nearly 200 years at this point. A little over 150 years at this point, who did not have citizenry rights, but they had money, right? And so what Frederick Douglass employs them to do is focus on education, and focus on organization. And so one of the pictures that you see, let me kind of go back to it, is this group. These are a lot of the guys who invited him to speak. It's the United Brotherhood of Liberty. This group will be the forerunner for the NAACP. Right? And so another thing that's really important that distinguishes Baltimore is one of the things that black folks could not do before the end of slavery was they could not congregate. Right? They couldn't come together. Baltimore establishes one of the first black churches in America in 1787, and it gives birth to a whole string of churches up and down Druid Hill Park. Right? These are typically AME churches, right? And that's really important. That's a key distinction, because the AMEs are steeped into education, and so that's what they want to build. That church down there, the Orchard Street Church, is right off of Pennsylvania Avenue, is a key vehicle for the Underground Railroad. So these are very forward-thinking people, even in the 17 and 1800s. Now, Baltimore is hugely segregated, but so when Baltimore needs land, if you're African American, you got to go, right? And so early one of the early African American settlements in Baltimore was right along Light Street, down by the harbor, all the way out to kind of like Camden Yards, right? But they needed the land to build Camden Station and to build that railroad. And so they literally picked up an entire population of people and they ported them to the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. That area is now called Old West Baltimore, but like they literally lived kind of congregated. It was like, I think it was about 8 or 9% of the population living on 2% of the land space. Right? But the thing is, you have integrated economies there. These people have to survive together. Right, they depend on one another. So there are judges, lawyers, and Indian chiefs living with amongst folks who are street diggers, if you know, and sanitation workers, and and domestics, if you will. But it's an integrated community, and so a lot of good things happen. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. Now, one of the things that you have to understand about Baltimore is like land is always at a premium because you're trying to what do the investors want to do? They want to make everything for money making, right? But you have to make some space for people to live. And one of the things that's a key element is the further you are down that social value chart, the more difficult it is for you to find a place to live in Baltimore. One of the things, this is what an old picture of Baltimore looks like before we kind of get into the row house structure. Baltimore reconfigures itself into these row house structures because land is at a premium. And so what comes out of that is this. And you'll notice that all row houses are not equal, right? And you can kind of tell, like, the median income, if you will, by the way that the structure looks, even though it's a connected structure. Now, really important story to tell, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Antero Piatella tells a much better story, Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped the Great American City. This is the front page of the New York Times in 1910. And the headline talks about the fact that Baltimore passed an ordinance prohibiting blacks and whites from living on the same block. All right? Now, you got to remember, it's 1910, and they are publishing a Baltimore story in New York. So you got to, you kind of get the sense of like how important this headline was. Another thing that distinguishes Baltimore and the way that they formed neighborhoods is that ordinance stays law for 7 or 8 years until it's overturned by the Supreme Court in, I think, 1980. And so you got to come up with a new vehicle. And one of the things that they came up with were these legally binding restrictive covenants in Homeland, Northwood, Guilford, and what neighborhood? Like literally up by the university, right? And essentially what this means is that you will not sell your house to a black person or Jewish person. And it was particularly sad because some of the folks who originally lived there were Jewish folks. This is part of a part of FDR's New Deal. And essentially what they want to do is raise housing values. You saw the housing bubble that we went through. Well, they had a very similar one, back in the 1930s. And they had to figure out how to value homes in a way that they could promote ownership. And so what they do is they go out and they look at these neighborhoods, and they don't value them based on the value of the actual house. They base the value on the person who lives in them. It's just, we're just going to say it's never, ever, ever equal. If you go and you look up Homer Hoyt, he's the economist who's in charge of this project, and you'll get a lot out of that. Johns Hopkins was involved in this. And so one of the things that these are not just state actors, because there's such a need for housing. It's kind of like they pull all hands on deck. What can we do to kind of solve some of these problems? And so, and between the 1950s and the 1960s, what Baltimore does is they start to kind of organize around how they would provide some levels of low cost housing. 90% of the people who would be displaced would be African Americans who had kind of moved either up from the South or had kind of spilled out into white neighborhoods, right? Um, This is actually the little red circle is kind of like Broadway all the way to Caroline Street. Actually, I have a better picture of it. And so that picture is actually taken from the dome, right? And they cleared about 1,100. They cleared about 750 houses, um, right? Like right across where the Hampton House and the outpatient center. There's about 1,100 families in there, um, and they built um, housing for the nurses and the physicians. Um, there was a promise of low-cost housing when the community came back to talk about that low-cost housing. Hopkins said, "Well, we don't actually have any money left in the budget." But miraculously, there was a student survey a little while later, and they asked the students who'd moved into these dorms, "How are you liking it?" And Baltimore is famous for its public park systems, right? And so they're like, "We're far from the parks. We don't have a place to exercise." And so what they built was the tennis courts and the swimming pool over in that area. They also built a fence, and this is really telling tale because most of the African Americans who lived on the east side kind of lived like right congregated around Old Town and northeast of Johns Hopkins, but they went to segregated schools, and the segregated school in the neighborhood was Dunbar. And so when they built the fence, the kids who lived in the neighborhood had to walk around Johns Hopkins in order to get to school. The guy in the middle is the mayor. That's Nancy Pelosi's father. This is what the redlining map looks like of Baltimore. One of the parts of this new housing plan was to build 6 new projects, and I told you 90% of the people who were displaced were African American, right? Almost all of them would go into these projects. You'd have 3 high-rise buildings built along Pratt Street, and you would have another 3 or 4 built along Martin Luther King Boulevard. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is you have the GI Bill that comes out of World War II, right? And this is the thing that that most sociologists and historians agree on, that this built the middle class. But was that equal, right? Well, if you kind of take a look at Baltimore, you'll find that it's a really precarious, it's not a real clear understanding. And so what you have in Baltimore is all these GIs who literally have lived in very tightly woven ethnic communities, right? Baltimore County is complete farmland, and they're looking at this as a money-making opportunity. And in 1955, the county executive announces that Baltimore County expansion would be for whites only. They were not welcoming blacks. They were only going to educate, if you were black in Baltimore County, they would educate your kid up until the 8th grade, right? Once your kid had reached the 8th grade, then he had to take a test, and then the county, in turn, would pay for your kid to go to go to high school in Baltimore City. Douglas High School over in West Baltimore. So Baltimore County surrounds Baltimore City. So no matter where you lived in the county, you had to provide your own transportation. And so he's really not incentivizing black migration, is he? The migration for black GIs, they created a space for them down in south of the harbor, right? Actually on the other side of the trash refinery. As a kid, you drive down that area, oh my God, it reeked. But this was an African American homeowner community, and it was Cherry Hill, right? Now the interesting thing about Cherry Hill, and I'm not going to get into the politics of it all, is it's one of the only homeowner communities in America with projects in it, right? And so even though they are homeowners, their political and economic power could not prevent the devaluation of their community. Right? Now, just kind of to push forward to today, what this looks like is after massive migration out of the city, out 95, out 83, out 795, about a third of the houses in Baltimore are vacant. Some of them sit over brown zones. Anybody know what a brown zone is? You don't want to build on the brown zone. You can't dig the soil because the soil is poison. And so with low regulation, this is kind of what we get. And so like tearing down a block of these is just a very expensive and complicated proposition because all of those houses are owned by different people or could be owned by different people. In a heavily segregated city, this is a picture in 2011, and what I pulled from these Baltimore neighborhood reports was what I thought were three important variables: life expectancy, median income, and a percentage of African Americans. And you can see where there's a high percentage of African Americans, it almost has an inverse relationship with life expectancy and median income. Canton, I find remarkable because these reports come out every 2 years, and the one that says median income now in 2011 was $77,222. 2 years before that, it was only $40,000. Right, and so what do you guys think all of the public systems are being built and supported in an area where there's a big tax base? Education is another important social determinant to talk about in Baltimore because unlike most other cities, Baltimore had a black education system before the end of slavery. It had literally 8 schools that were supported by either the Quakers, the African Americans, or the Methodist Church. Right? Those schools are taken over by the city at the end of the Civil War, and they began to kind of like manage the output. So it becomes public in nature, and Black Baltimore would continue to kind of create their own substructures for it because we live in they were living in a segregated society. So they would start a centenary school in 1867 that would evolve to Morgan College. They would also start a teacher school that would evolve to Coppin. And so they were literally taking Frederick Douglass seriously, right? They were creating substructures, even though there are no social. These people pay taxes, and there are no subsystems from the city that support them, so they're building their own. I want to talk about public and private health. There's not a whole lot in the way of public health for African Americans here until kind of like the mid 1800s, right? And so, essentially. I encourage you, in particular you folks who are in at the School of Public Health, take Graham Mooney's class. He teaches a class called the History of Baltimore, History of Public Health in Baltimore. And the thing that you'll find kind of like remarkable is the substructures and the structures and the substructures that were created around Baltimore to track what was going on with African Americans, but not to do a whole lot about what was going on with them in not improving their health models. That picture over there is a picture of the Lum Block, where literally the Eastern Health District was actually tracking, how fast people died in the community. The picture on the right top right, that's a tuberculosis ward. One of the things that Baltimore did was to it's a very spiritual city, and so they began to build bathhouses. And so, they would find African American men, these guys would get locked up with pockets full of money because they had no place to stay, right? And filthy, sleeping in the movie theater. They thought they were vagrants. They just had no place to live. And so the Walters in particular kind of built 7 to 8, and some of these structures still exist around, in Baltimore. It's a great book called The Great Unwashed. I encourage you to kind of take a look at one of the ways that Baltimore tried to solve its public health problem, particularly for African American and poor folks. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. I'm just going to tell you, when it comes to research medicine, in Baltimore in particular, I mean, first off, the research schools are kind of tightly woven. They're challenging one another. Harvard recorded that African Americans have been literally studied more than any other population on the planet. They wanted to find variation. They were looking for variation. You know, that was a question that Jefferson put on the table back in the 1700s. There has to be some variation, you know, to justify what it is that we're doing. And so what Harvard did was, I mean, there were lots of other medical schools and public health schools, you know, and so when you think in terms of like what the history of African Americans have been in this country with respect to research medicine, it's been the same no matter where you go. Right, and so Baltimore is, you know, in particular, I mean, and it gets worse in certain places. If you start talking about slavery, you know, during slavery times, you know, some very ghastly things happen. Again, I'm going to quote one of my Hopkins sources, Dr. Brody, who was actually my dad's boss at one point in time. It's the worst crime area in the United States. You could call in the National Guard and declare martial law. And a resident from East Baltimore, you know, distrust flows a couple of ways, right? It's usually not just one way. They say that Hopkins has taken over everything. It's just like slavery days. They take your land and then you got to go. You know, so no relationship to healthcare though, right? Now, the war on drugs, another subsystem that we need to talk about. Now, one of the things that you have to understand about the war on drugs is it's not really a right or left proposition, is it? Right? Everybody has earned on the war on drugs that actually starts around, I want to say, it starts in the Nixon administration and really gets gas in it during the Reagan administration. But it's carried out here locally as well. You know, there's an outcry, there's a public outcry to do something about what's going on in the communities. And everybody, you will not get elected, it's a double negative, by not being tough on crime. If you are tough on crime, it's almost kind of like a shoe-in, you know. But what does it produce? The U.S. now incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. You guys know these stats. 5% of the world's we have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its inmate population. Since 1970, there's been about a 700 increase from 300,000 prisoners to 2.2 million. Right? How many of those guys are fathers? 1.1 million. So it's almost kind of like you took that full population that you had, kind of like right after, you know, around World War II and right after, you know, this building up. Those African Americans typically had jobs because, like I said, you know, it was nearly full employment. We've taken almost that entire population and put them in penitentiaries. There are more black men in jail today that were enslaved in 1850. Now, white Americans do the crime, but black Americans get the time, right? Very telling. Actually, white Americans actually do a little bit more drugs than black people. Not a well-known fact. In particular, cocaine, LSD, marijuana. But blacks are much more likely to go to jail. 75% drug convictions are black and Latino. 7 convictions are kingpins. And so these are guys who are like, actually the middle rung, you know, but these are the guys that they're supposed to be after. 93% of the people who are locked up are low-level, nonviolent offenders, right? More than 73,000 people go through Baltimore Central booking each year. 73,000. That's more than that's half of, it's all of Camden Yards and half of M&T, right? Bureau of Justice Statistics says that 1 in 17 white men will go to jail, whereas 1 in 3 black babies will go to jail. Now, what was Maryland's response to that? Right? So when you ask me why did Freddie Gray run, look at the system that produced the educational system for him. They said he had lead paint poisoning. Look at his housing conditions for generations and generations. One of my favorite barbershop conversations is to sit around with my buddies and ask, what if all of our forefathers were living, and we talked to them and we asked them, what was your relationship like? We want to talk to your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather. Do you think that story improves as you go through time? As you get back to slavery? The conditions for African Americans, in particular in this city, have been, even when there were not high crime rates, surveillance, containment, things that are not productive, if you will. Why wouldn't Freddie Gray run? Any questions? That's it, guys.
Thank you so much, Stephen. For those of you who do have questions, please come to the mics. Unfortunately, the wireless mics aren't working in this room, so if you can skate up to the edge of the room and come to the mics for questions, this is the time to do so. I know there was someone that just raised their hand. Yell loud and I'll repeat it. It's being recorded, so that's why we're...
Okay, I was just going to ask if you had any other suggestions of books on the history of Baltimore, especially for people who are new to the city as students. The whole time I was watching this, I was like, why aren't we required to see this the minute we come into the school? So do you have any other suggestions of other?
I do this lecture I actually do a much broader, deeper kind of look at this, and I have literally 3 or 4 pages of books that you could look at. But off the top of my head, Antero's book, Not My Neighborhood: How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City, I think is a really interesting one. Howell Brown in Baltimore. Baltimore actually desegregates public schools 2 years before Brown versus the Board decision, right? And then the federal government comes in '76. It's like, we're going to sue you because there's literally been no integration, And I want you to kind of, that's an interesting look at how people ran fast while actually standing still. What other, Mindy, you got any?
Well, I'll come to Mike since we're recording. So I would just also recommend, if you haven't seen, Source has a small series of online modules to help prepare people to work in the community. And the first one is about the history between Johns Hopkins and East Baltimore. Stephen's featured, Graham Mooney's featured, but we also have a whole list of resources, which includes a whole slew of books, including Stephen's own book list and other resources. So a lot of information is available on our Source website. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Currently at the School of Public Health. I have a question about baking because I thought what you said about the numbers game was super interesting. I wasn't aware. I was Googling a lot while you were talking, so forgive me. But, I learned that the numbers game, which is connected to our modern day lottery, was a source for lines of credit, actually, for...
that was my point.
Yep, African Americans, and that was something I did not know. Today in Baltimore, I think this article was either in the New York Times or the Baltimore Sun shortly after the unrest. What we find is that African Americans pay on average $15,000 more for their mortgages than do white Americans living in the city, which, speaks to sort of what, not only are the home values being, suppressed in certain neighborhoods, but on top of that, when African Americans do go to banks, they have a very different, quantitatively different experience on average. And so I just wondered if you could speak more to that history of the the relationship between African Americans in Baltimore and other cities with the banking systems and how that influences the building of wealth in African American communities.
What relationship? The thing is like I said, this is a place where throughout its history up until like the 1960s, there's incredible sums of capital. That's why you have banks on every corner. Now, even though, I'm sorry, so I timed myself so I wouldn't go over, right, Mindy? Even though there were incredible sums of capital available, there were very few opportunities for capital investment. The other thing, I mean, even in housing, and so think about like that, like throughout the course of history. At some point in time, America started to kind of pull that equity out of the house and do positive things with it. Like for a lot of my friends who come from majority culture, those loans went to school. You educated your children with it. And so you might be at an equal status, at some point in time. But what it does is you start to see kind of like this gradual a widening, if you will, of the wealth gap. Now, the thing that's really interesting about that the numbers game was everybody knew it was one primary person in Baltimore. This is not a big city, it was one primary head of the numbers game, right? I mean, he was extraordinarily well known by the banks in Baltimore. I mean, this guy lives into his old age, and his wife actually becomes the first black woman member of the Annapolis legislature. So he's garnering power, in this position, until the folks in local government said, you know what, nah, it's been too much. And so essentially what they ended up doing is they cart him off to jail, and he would die an old man in prison. And what he does is he shows him how to run his game. He gives so in order to keep his freedom, from that point until his death, he traded the numbers game, which actually became the Maryland lottery. So another place where wealth just kind of changes hands.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I had a question about a lot of the vacant housing around Baltimore. I've been told that this is a big reason for the lack of a tax base in the city, and therefore fewer resources and services to provide to the citizens in the actual city. Is this true? And if so, who actually owns these houses? And also, what's the origin for a lot of the vacant housing right now?
The vacant housing today is so one of the reasons that I showed you the population chart is if you'll notice that the more the blacker the city gets, the more the population goes down, right? And so, like I said, there's an inverse relationship. The other part of that is, big part of that is opportunity. When somebody tells you that you can't go to the nearest place where they're building all the new houses, you're kind of left in this environment, right? And some people wanted to stay here. They wanted the opportunity to kind of like create on their own. The problem with that is the city is old and hasn't been invested in quite some time. And so while these folks are kind of migrating outward and building new substructures, new schools, new housing, that don't take as much maintenance, African American population is more or less left back here in Baltimore to kind of manage what I like to call the decay. So when you hear that, you have to kind of, when you hear that stat that Baltimore City school children get, per child, this X amount of dollars, you have to remember that a significant portion of that might be going to school upkeep because these schools are 100 years old.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk today. I wonder if you'd have any insights into moving forward. all of these things. And I guess what comes to mind,
You mean
coach
a fix?
Yeah. Well, he recently popularized the idea that's not new of reparations and thinking about as we look at historical inequities. And so,
I think honestly, I don't have a fix. I tell people all the time that the fix will come in understanding what went into building the system, and that that's why I'm here. I think that most folks who kind of come to this town know very little about like what its development was like. Working and living in Baltimore. One of the things that you never get used to is people judging your city from the outside, coming in. And so I think, a big part of kind of moving forward is literally getting to know your city, getting to know how it functions, getting to know how it historically functions, and start to kind of break down those barriers. You'll see, like when you drive through Baltimore, how segregated Baltimore is by traffic patterns. So, you can drive in certain, like when you get up to close to Homewood, a lot of those streets are one way. There are not a whole lot of entryways into that town. And so we still have, these practices that we have engaged in, historically, they're still part of our culture. Was that helpful?
sure, I'm sure there's a whole other couple hours.
Good.
Spirit of getting to know the city better, but on a bit of a more positive note, to some people that just moved here, what are your favorite things about Baltimore that you think we should know?
Oh, my favorite things. One of my favorite things is actually this, that Baltimore does have, Baltimore's history is not boring. It is not boring. It is full of wonderful tales. It is loaded with wonderful people. One of the things that, again, I kind of, we focus on a kind of a negative narrative here, but when I talk to my older relatives, it was like jobs were separate, but people worked together. You know what I mean? So there was kind of there's still even though the neighborhoods were segregated, there was almost kind of still a continuity in the way that we live. So when I talk about food economies, right? It wasn't that those Arabers, that's what they were called, went into only white communities, only black communities. This was a lifestyle that we kind of all enjoyed. Music was, Baltimore has a huge and wonderful, rich music tradition. And so there's a lot of, and of course, my favorites, the Orioles and the Ravens.
Member of the Hopkins community, very proud to be born and raised in Baltimore.
Yay!
One of maybe not so many. I wonder if you could speak just a bit to the combination of this really startling institutional structural racism in a city that, if you look at the leadership, the mayor, I think superintendent of schools, police commissioner, a lot of the big positions are taken by African American members of the community, and how that is kind of juxtaposed.
Well, Baltimore has always, I hope one of the things that you kind of take away from this is Baltimore has always had a African American intelligentsia, if you will, right? With W.E.B. Du Bois titled kind of like the talented 10th, if you kind of believe in that concept. And one of the things that, that instrument, I think, in a lot of ways is still, fixed to Baltimore. And so a lot of folks that you see kind of running these offices, a lot of their legacies, like our mayor's father was steeped in politics for quite a while here. The flip side of that is Baltimoreans were left a mess. You know what I mean? And you cannot, when I talked about systems and subsystems and not being able to kind of decouple them, Baltimore is totally and completely enclosed by Baltimore County. I challenge you to go out and look on a map and find another city where that happened. So when you were talking about, who's the guy who was asking what to look at? Look at how Baltimore was annexed, and how that kind of plays into like their power, and their power base. Um, the other part of I think that's really important to understand, no matter what you read, um, you'll find that blacks and whites, or I don't like to say whites, but white minority ethnics were kind of steeped in this together. This wasn't a thing that they kind of like did apart from one another. There was always a kind of black power base here who was negotiating, if you will, from a lower position, but still negotiating. There are a couple of political science professors who tell you that um, the civil rights movement jumped over Baltimore, right? Because they had negotiation power. So where other African American cities and areas were completely depressed and there was no opportunity, you had an intelligentsia who was constantly negotiating and trying to kind of strike a balance, and were okay in a lot of ways with being separate. One of the reasons that school integration doesn't really work well here is because black people don't buy into it. Blacks are at the table. They are part of kind of building this new infrastructure. But there's a trepidation from going out of my neighborhood into crossing the boundaries, if you will. And so one of the things that's really striking is these cultural dimensions. They kind of come together to do what I like to think is like some really long-term harm to the way that we think about like managing cities today.
Thank you so much for your talk today. Sincerely appreciate it. I was curious, a lot of history and sociology shows that wherever there is this sort of structural racism or structural division of people on whatever characteristics, that violence often accompanies that. So that's not a unique thing. But I'm curious, any specific pieces of Baltimore's history or things that are unique that may play into current levels of violence that we see. I think that homicides surpassed New York in absolute numbers this past summer, unfortunately. And any other comments on sort of the growth and direction of the Baltimore Police Department as the city has changed, or any of those questions? Thank you.
Well, I think that I look at historical context, right? And so one of the things that's really important to kind of understand about Baltimore's history, as I said, it was a pretty violent place, right? There have been like maybe a dozen major riots in Baltimore, and the last two have been with African Americans, right? So let's kind of, contextualize that. I mean, this is a city where when the Massachusetts Regiment came down to come through Baltimore to head out to over to Washington to protect the Capitol, at the advent of the Civil War, they were moving from President Station to Camden Yards, and a riot broke out somewhere along Pratt Street, and several people got killed. There was a banking riot here. There have been a number of. This was a city that was a huge labor component in the city. There have been women killed in riots here, in labor disputes. So this kind of, the fact that you know about the ones that happened in '68 and 2015, they kind of have they have origins. I mean, in the way that Baltimoreans have typically handled, disputes. What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
On the relationship between police, particularly maybe that historical point that you mentioned, that the way that people refer to areas are police districts, and where that influence might have come from.
Well, I think that one of the things is society gets the policing system that it wants, right? I mean, and so what I mean by that is, in a lot of ways, I mean, in particular since the 60s, there's still a 30 some odd percent, or 40 some odd percent other population, roughly, right? Um, and Baltimore policing has largely been, for black communities, a different kind of instrument, if you will. Surveillance and containment, right? I think a lot of that has come out of partly out of the drug culture, but it's like the question I asked early on, about like our grandfathers and great grandfathers. Even when there was not a high crime rate, these were the tactical elements that were used by police in African American communities. I grew up in a kind of middle class neighborhood. Actually, I grew up not far from Berea. Berea was actually a mixed neighborhood when I was a kid, right? And you had the Northeastern District on Harford Road, and the older kids, I kid you not, the older boys would tell you, "Oh, you don't want to get locked up." I said, "What do you mean?" Well, there was the A&P right beside the Northeastern District, and they said, "Oh, because they'll take you behind the A&P and give you a wooden shampoo." You guys know what a wooden shampoo is? A billy club, And so even before, these were tactics that have been used throughout the history of the African Americans being in America. And so, those things, in a lot of ways, the tactics haven't changed, in high-level ways, the tactics haven't changed since slavery, And so how do you get folks off of a cultural bias, or an institution off of a cultural bias that it has had for more than 300 years? I don't really know the answer to that. I wish I did.
We'll do one more question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Once again, I want to echo someone's comment that we should be required to have this. So I'm so sorry, my question is not really short, but it's kind of two parts of the same question. I'm curious, why do you think, are there unique aspects of the way that Baltimore City's political system is set up that makes it different from other cities, since a lot of these policies you talked about are very national in scale, right? Like the Federal Housing Administration, GI bills. These systems of oppression are so entrenched. Because one time I had a conversation with a professor here in Bloomberg who said that because Baltimore City council members don't have as much budgetary power as other cities, which is why whoever owns, I'm quoting this person, which is why whoever owns a mayor owns Baltimore, and Hopkins always owns the mayor, unquote. And also where the power base and the negotiation base is today, like you have mentioned. Thank you. So that's, at least I think that's the same question. But.
I'm confused by your question. So what I heard.
That's unique to Baltimore. Like us change so slow.
No, not. One of the things that that I learned about Baltimore history is because you have this rich economic system, and I didn't really go into this in my lecture. Is Baltimore becomes a boilerplate for other cities. Right? And so like that New York Times article that you saw about housing, how many of you guys think that started in Baltimore and stayed in Baltimore? Right? We talked about research medicine, right? It was just kind of like an aside, but these things, Baltimore is a learning laboratory about how to manage social and ethnic dynamics, throughout the 1900s. And so no, my answer would be no. It's just kind of, I have no proof, but I would find it very difficult to believe that the kind of political models that we have here don't mirror some of the other major metropolitan cities that are highly occupied by African Americans. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Stephen, so very much for coming and sharing with us today.
Thanks,
Thank you all for coming.